I live in the heart of Chicago's Southside. Each frame I capture tells a story. I try to challenge the narrative through my own lens. I grapple with my own displacement being the product of an adoption. I never knew if my mother was alive. I didn't know my father. I didn't know if I had any siblings at all. And the first question they had when we finally met online was, "What's it like living in the United States?" They kept hearing about gun violence. Is this how the US has been seen internationally? They were scared for my own safety due to my skin color. It broke my heart that the big concern that my mother had regarding me living in the US was, would I eventually become a statistic? My mother can't read or write, yet photographs was a way that we could display our love and affection to each other. It was a way that, even though I didn't know Portuguese, she was able to understand my own existence through images. Growing up in the United States, it just felt like there was something missing. I never looked like anyone around me. I didn't speak my own native language. I just felt lost. Even when I was younger, I didn't end up completing high school. I ended up doing 10th grade twice. It was just a very alienating experience. I was really frustrated and I had a lot of misplaced anger. I had nowhere to focus that. Even though I grew up in upstate New York, I found such a community living here in the heart of Chicago, which bridges between Little Village and Pilsen. The longer I do this project, I realize it's not me documenting others, it's me documenting my own existence. I'm seeing myself in each individual that I photograph. One word that gets tossed around is the word privilege. I always associated that word with the concept of white privilege, and the more I did this project, I realized that privilege is not a definitive thing. It's fluid. Depending on the environment that you're in, it absolutely changes. I had the privilege to go into these communities and document. Sometimes I'd photograph these areas and no one would even bat an eye or even notice me. I was able to get the authentic view of what these neighborhoods are, and that was a privilege of mine, and that took me months to realize that. Prior to going to these neighborhoods, I tend to ask around, what people's point of view is and, etc. And there's a neighborhood about a mile south of us called Back of the Yards. And everyone was telling me how dangerous it is and, this negativity that surrounds us, almost like a darkness. And I go there and I realize that everyone looks like me. And that hurt. I shouldn't have to beg for you to see the humanity in me due to my skin color. I shouldn't have to beg for you to see the humanity of these communities and these neighborhoods. Yet, we're in 2023, and it's more important than ever to talk about this. And it's exhausting, and sometimes you feel like you're a broken cassette player, but it needs to be done. And the camera is such an important tool for this conversation. To document these spaces, it's more important than ever. We can't let the narrative of these spaces solely be that of the media, because realistically, they don't have our humanity in mind, and that's heartbreaking. And these neighborhoods are full of culture, yet you can feel the weight of trauma, the generational trauma, and that what goes along with redlining, along with segregation, and all the laws that are in place to keep minorities down. In hindsight, I always knew I was a person of color in the United States and what that bears, but I was always seen as less than others, but I didn't really understand how we got there. And one of the breakthrough moments was actually putting an academic lens onto this project and really looking how this is not a coincidence. This was constructed on purpose, and that needs to be emphasized. I remember when I was 22 years old and my partner was driving the vehicle and I was the passenger. And a cop pulled us over with his intention strictly to speak to me, to make sure I was not a convicted felon. It was humiliating. And, I've never even been in detention. Granted, I never did good in school. I was never, a bad kid when it come to academia or, getting in trouble with the law. And it was just, it stole the humanity away from me. Having to defend that you're human and, you're not a criminal solely on the bearing of skin color was such a daunting and just something I thought would never happen. And I realized that, the further I went along with puberty, I was seen as a threat. And, we live in such a trigger environment that I didn't speak up, and I let that police officer rob the humanity out of my hands. Each photograph I'm taking, I'm figuring out who I am as a person. I really was just robbed of my identity, and that was such an isolating experience. But the more I'm traversing through these neighborhoods and speaking to people and hearing people's stories, they're letting me in, they're sharing their experience. And, I don't ever want to have this project be, about objectifying one person or objectifying another. It's about learning from each other, it's about hearing each other, and more importantly, making sure that they're heard. And that was something that I really struggled with when I started this project, was regarding ethics. Do you have the right to photograph someone else? What's the difference between treating someone as a subject or an object, or are they both? It's such a gray area, and I realized that I had to sometimes take photographs that may make other people uncomfortable, and that's absolutely necessary. How do you photograph an environment or a community and then just neglect things that make people feel uncomfortable? Now, let me be very clear that when this did happen, I did speak to them and we had a dialogue and an understanding, but I sometimes think that, especially with people who are houseless, that we just treat them as invisible, and even more so in our world. And I think there is a real difference between, taking a photograph to share their story, to give them a voice, and then an image to plaster on the wall. And I think one prime example of this was a photograph that I took in July of 2023 when it was about 95, 97 degrees, ridiculously hot. And I was walking near the South Loop heading towards the Art Institute of Chicago, and a gentleman was reaching out and really I thought, just begging for money. And I could not have been any more wrong in my prejudice we were showing. And he simply needed water. And the crazy part about it was the water fountain was just on the other side of the street. He didn't want any money. He simply could not bear to carry his own body weight across the street. It took us about 5 minutes just to cross Congress Plaza Drive to get to the other side where the water was. And I sat with him for about 45 minutes, and as he was rinsing his face and just trying to hydrate himself, we just talked, and he told me his story, and with his consent, I asked him if I could take his photograph, and he just looked at me and smiled and was like, absolutely. And this is what I think photography is all about. And the idea of a photograph was, he was able to be seen on his own terms. And that's something I don't think we speak about enough. My brother and my mother, who I've never met, and now I'm 34 years old, it's a way for me to talk to them. It's a way for an idea to be expressed without a language barrier. And, the more I do this, my mother, I was taken away from her at such a young age, and, she doesn't know anything about me. But these photographs of me living in these neighborhoods and me meeting these people are a way for me to open up, and a way for me to show her that, this is who I am. And that even though that I have to deal with race and racism and segregation and all those horrible avenues in the United States, this is an avenue that we can communicate. And I couldn't be more grateful for my family, for my wife, for my parents who adopted me, who have given me every great opportunity to pursue this. When I dropped out of high school, I didn't know what would become of me. And I'm finally leaving, I hope, the world a better place than I found it. I just hope my family's proud of me, and I hope that my mom, who I've yet to meet, knows how much I love her, and that I wouldn't be doing this project if it wasn't for her. And even though that we've never met, this is the most vulnerable I've ever been. There's always a dialogue about when you photograph someone, there's that vulnerability that they have to display to the lens. But really, the photographer has to also be vulnerable. And I had to really dig deep through this project and really just take on my childhood trauma that I've been carrying for the past 34 years and really figure out who I am as a person. And I guess a lot of that was locked behind closed doors. For my mom or my family to really know who I am as a person, I had to be open up and be vulnerable. And that was difficult.